There are moments when the soul senses something long before the mind can explain it. A heaviness that appears without cause, a chill that settles in the heart even when life seems calm, a strange pressure behind you, as though something follows your steps in silence. These are the moments when darkness moves quietly, choosing not to confront you openly, but to linger just close enough to drain your peace. Hidden attacks rarely announce themselves. They slip into the atmosphere around you, waiting for exhaustion, discouragement, or fear to weaken your guard. But heaven is not blind to what you cannot see. Saint Michael, the commander of God's armies, sees every shadow that attempts to follow you. He moves where your senses cannot. He cuts what your strength cannot. He breaks what your eyes cannot detect. And this prayer is the moment heaven steps forward. The shadow that walks behind, understanding hidden pursuits of darkness. There are forms of darkness that do not strike loudly, do not confront directly, and do not reveal themselves in obvious ways. Instead, they follow. They remain just close enough to influence the heart, but far enough to avoid detection. This kind of hidden pursuit is one of the enemy's most subtle strategies. Scripture teaches that evil often disguises itself, waiting for opportune moments, seeking weakened places in the soul. Not every spiritual attack looks like chaos. Some look like constant discouragement, unexplained restlessness, sudden heaviness, or a draining of inner strength that makes no sense. These shadows attach themselves quietly, lingering behind the person rather than around them. They influence atmosphere, not events. They manipulate emotion, not circumstance. And because they approach indirectly, the person often blames themselves for what is actually a spiritual disturbance pressing from the outside. The enemy prefers to follow rather than attack because pursuing darkness creates weariness. It creates the sense of being watched, drained, or pulled backward. It weakens resolve over time. Sometimes this shadow comes from unresolved wounds that the enemy exploits. Sometimes it comes from past environments where spiritual negativity left residue on the soul. Sometimes it follows through generational patterns or persistent temptations that track the heart's vulnerabilities. Other times it appears when a person steps closer to God. Darkness follows because it cannot tolerate the light awakening within them. No matter the origin, the effect is the same. The person feels pursued. They feel spiritually stalked. They feel as though something is pressing in the unseen world, even if they cannot describe it with words. This experience is often misunderstood, dismissed, or minimized. Yet the saints spoke clearly about such realities. Saint Peter warned that the enemy prowls, watching for openings. Saint Paul described battles in the heavenly realms that unfold beyond physical perception. And throughout Christian tradition, hidden attacks were recognized not as imagination, but as subtle movements of darkness seeking to weaken the soul. Awareness of this pursuit does not create fear. It creates clarity. It allows the soul to recognize that what it feels may not be psychological weakness, but spiritual pressure. This is why Saint Michael is essential. He is not only the defender who blocks attacks, he is the heavenly warrior who confronts what follows in silence. He stands behind the soul as well as before it. He sees the shadows that attempt to attach themselves. He moves into the unseen and breaks what tries to cling. No pursuit escapes him, no hidden attack withstands him. And it is precisely here, in the awareness of these unseen pursuits, that the soul becomes ready for the next truth. Saint Michael does not merely stop darkness, he destroys the forces that follow you. Saint Michael as the destroyer of pursuing forces. When darkness follows a soul, it does not do so out of strength but out of strategy. Pursuing forces depend on secrecy, hoping the person will never recognize the spiritual weight pressing behind them. But what follows you in silence is fully visible to heaven. Saint Michael does not simply wait for darkness to strike. He is the destroyer of pursuing forces, the archangel who hunts, exposes, and dismantles every threat moving in the unseen. His mission is not passive defense, it is active confrontation. He does not merely guard the soul, he chases what chases you. Saint Michael's authority comes from the moment he stood before God and declared, "Who is like God?" That cry shattered the rebellion of Lucifer and established Michael as the one who drives evil away from anything entrusted to divine protection. Every time the soul calls upon him, he responds with the same heavenly ferocity that cast down the ancient serpent described in Revelation. Darkness can follow you, but it cannot outrun Saint Michael. Pursuing spirits, whether rooted in past wounds, generational burdens, spiritual residue, or direct oppression, often attempt to maintain influence by staying close but hidden. Their goal is not always to attack directly, but to weaken the soul through persistent spiritual pressure. This is precisely the kind of darkness Saint Michael destroys most decisively. He does not simply interrupt their influence, he dismantles their ability to return. He cuts the spiritual cords that bind. He breaks the unseen chains that pull. He burns away the shadows that cling. Christian tradition speaks of Saint Michael as the defender, but also as the avenger of God's justice. This title is rarely discussed, but it reveals something essential. Saint Michael moves against darkness not simply to protect the soul, but to restore justice where the enemy has trespassed. He does not negotiate with evil. He does not tolerate spiritual stalking. He does not allow the enemy to trail behind the people of God. When invoked with faith, he confronts the darkness that follows, at its root, at its origin, and at its source. And this changes everything. The soul that once felt pursued begins to feel defended. The heaviness that once pressed from behind begins to lift. The atmosphere shifts, the pressure breaks. What followed you is now forced to flee. When Saint Michael steps into this battle, darkness loses both its hiding place and its power. Now the soul is ready for a deeper truth. What Saint Michael defeats in the unseen, he also reveals. For darkness collapses the moment it is brought into God's light. The heavenly exposure, when Saint Michael reveals what was hidden. Every hidden attack depends on darkness for survival. Its strength is not in its power, but in its secrecy. The enemy's most persistent pursuits draw their force from remaining unseen, unrecognized, undetected. What the soul cannot name, it cannot resist. What it cannot perceive, it cannot fight. This is why pursuing darkness clings to the shadows, hoping to operate in silence, hoping the person attributes every pressure, every heaviness, every sudden wave of fear to emotion rather than spiritual interference. But secrecy is not stronger than heaven. The moment Saint Michael enters the battle, the unseen is exposed. What once hid in silence is forced into the light, and the moment darkness is revealed, its power begins to collapse. The first work of Saint Michael in this heavenly exposure is illumination. Not emotional illumination, but spiritual illumination. The ability to discern what is happening beyond the visible. When the Archangel approaches, he brings with him the light of God's truth. This light does not merely reveal the enemy's movements, it reveals the soul's condition, the breaches fear has created, the vulnerabilities darkness has tried to exploit. It reveals the areas where lies have taken root. It reveals the subtle pressures that were never psychological, but spiritual. This illumination is not meant to frighten, but to free, because truth is the beginning of deliverance. In spiritual theology, exposure is considered one of the highest forms of divine mercy. God reveals not to shame, but to liberate. The enemy thrives in confusion, but God restores clarity. And Saint Michael, whose very presence is a manifestation of divine clarity, cuts through the fog that anxiety, oppression, and spiritual residue create. Suddenly, the person realizes that what weighed on them was not imagination. What drained them had a source. What followed them had intention. This realization is not frightening. It is empowering. It is the moment the soul steps out of confusion and into spiritual awareness. Saint Michael's exposure also reveals patterns the enemy tried to keep hidden. For many, the darkness that follows is tied to old wounds, memories the enemy uses to reopen emotional and spiritual vulnerability. For others, the pursuit comes from patterns handed down through generations, burdens the soul inherited without choosing. Some attacks follow because the person is on the threshold of spiritual growth, and the enemy seeks to discourage before breakthrough arrives. No matter the reason, Saint Michael exposes the pattern. He shows the soul why the pursuit began, where the darkness attached, and how it attempted to maintain influence. This exposure is not merely intellectual, it is experiential. The person often feels a sudden shift, a moment of realization, or a sudden awareness that something behind them has been pushed away. Sometimes this comes as a moment of clarity after days or weeks of heaviness. Sometimes it appears as a sudden calm after a long period of internal turbulence. Sometimes it manifests as a physical sensation, a release of tension, a deep breath, a sense of something lifting off the shoulders. St. Michael's exposure is not abstract, it is tangible. The soul feels it as surely as it would feel a weight removed from the body. Another part of this heavenly exposure is the revelation of lies. Pursuing darkness often attaches itself through deceit. You are unprotected. You are alone. This fear is your fault. You will never be free. These statements are not thoughts originating from the person. They are distortions projected by the enemy to keep the soul in a state of quiet despair. When Saint Michael exposes these lies, they lose their grip. The soul recognizes them for what they are. It begins to see reality through divine truth rather than fear's distortion. Once lies are recognized, they are powerless. The exposure also protects the soul from future attacks. When the enemy is forced into the light, the patterns of influence become visible. The person becomes spiritually wiser. They begin to notice when heaviness tries to settle again, or when the enemy attempts to reintroduce old thoughts or old fears. This awareness is not paranoia, it is spiritual maturity. Saint Michael trains the soul to discern without fear, to recognize spiritual movements without being shaken by them, to understand the tactics of darkness without being intimidated. Most importantly, heavenly exposure prepares the soul for deliverance. Saint Michael does not expose without destroying. Once the darkness is revealed, he cuts its connection, he breaks its pursuit, he dismantles its foothold. But deliverance requires readiness, and readiness comes from understanding. A person cannot fully surrender a battle they do not see. Exposure brings vision, vision brings surrender, and surrender opens the way for total victory. Christian tradition teaches that darkness cannot remain where light enters. The Gospel of John proclaims that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Saint Michael carries this divine light into the hidden spaces of the soul. He shines it on everything the enemy hoped would remain in obscurity. He clears out the shadows. He reveals the truth. He prepares the heart for freedom. And so the soul, once confused, begins to understand. The heaviness had a source. The fear had a pattern. The pursuit had a purpose. But none of it escapes the eyes of heaven. Nothing follows a child of God without Saint Michael knowing. Now that the hidden has been revealed, the soul is ready for the next stage, the prayer that will cut through darkness itself, breaking every unseen attack and destroying the shadows that once followed in silence. The prayer that cuts through invisible darkness. There comes a moment in every spiritual battle when understanding is no longer enough. Awareness exposes the enemy, but exposure alone does not break its influence. Once the hidden pursuit has been revealed, the soul stands at a decisive threshold. It must speak, it must pray, it must invoke heaven with authority. This is the moment when prayer becomes more than words. It becomes a weapon. It becomes a sword of divine truth. It becomes the very fire that cuts through the invisible darkness that once followed the soul in silence. This type of prayer is not timid, hesitant, or uncertain. It is not born from fear, but from clarity. It rises from the soul that finally understands what is pressing against it and recognizes that it cannot win the battle alone. This recognition is not weakness, it is strength. For the soul that acknowledges its need for divine intervention positions itself under heaven's protection. Saint Michael does not respond to vague whispers or half-hearted invocations. He responds to the soul that calls with intention, with trust, with the firm conviction that God is greater than anything that follows behind them. To pray a prayer that cuts darkness, the soul must first embrace a truth repeated throughout Scripture. Authority comes not from emotion, but from God. In the Gospel, according to Luke chapter 10, verse 19, Christ declares that he gives authority over all the power of the enemy. The soul does not pray from its own strength. It prays from Christ's authority. And it is precisely this authority that Saint Michael acts upon. He is not moved by fear-based prayers. He is moved by faith-based declarations, the kind of prayer that aligns the soul with God's sovereignty and commands darkness to release its hold. This prayer begins with an act of inner positioning. The soul turns toward God, grounding itself in truth. It acknowledges God as the source of power, Saint Michael as the defender appointed by heaven, and itself as a child of God who has the right to call upon divine protection. This mental and spiritual alignment is essential. When the soul prays from identity rather than insecurity, the prayer becomes sharp. It becomes precise. It becomes capable of cutting into the unseen realm. The next movement of this prayer is invocation. Not a casual mention, but an earnest calling upon Saint Michael by name and by mission. The soul speaks to him as the one who shattered the ancient rebellion, the one who cast down the destroyer, the one who stands in God's presence with unwavering obedience. Invocation acknowledges his role and invites his intervention. It tells the enemy that the person is no longer standing alone. It tells the enemy that heaven has been summoned. Then the prayer enters its most powerful phase, the command. Not a command issued by human authority, but a command grounded in God's word. This is the moment the soul speaks not to Saint Michael, but against the darkness itself. Just as Christ rebuked the storm, just as the apostles rebuked spirits, the soul declares that every hidden attack must break, every shadow must flee, every oppressive force must dissolve under the authority of God. Prayer, in this moment, becomes a decree, and decrees, spoken in faith, reshape the spiritual atmosphere. This kind of prayer is not loudness, it is conviction. It is not emotional force, it is spiritual certainty. It is the soul declaring, "I belong to God, and darkness has no claim on me." Saint Michael moves swiftly when such a declaration is made. He drives his sword into the unseen, severing ties the enemy used to follow the soul. He burns away the shadows with the fire of divine justice. He cuts the spiritual cords that connected the person to past wounds or generational burdens. He destroys the remnants of oppression that tried to hide behind emotion or confusion. This prayer also includes surrender. Not surrender to the enemy, but surrender to God's protection. The soul must release the places where fear has rooted itself. It must let go of the belief that it must fight alone. Surrender opens the heart to divine action. Without surrender, prayer becomes self-reliance disguised as faith. But when the soul truly releases control, Saint Michael steps into spaces human strength cannot enter. He dismantles what fear built. He restores what darkness damaged. He frees what anxiety bound. There is another dimension to this prayer: proclamation. The soul must declare the truth that replaces the lies darkness whispered. It speaks verses of Scripture aloud. It proclaims the promises of God not as hopes, but as realities. Psalm 27, Psalm 91, Romans chapter 8, and the authority of Christ become the words that cut through the unseen. Proclamation strengthens the soul, terrifies the enemy, and empowers Saint Michael's mission. As the prayer continues, something shifts. The spiritual pressure begins to break. The heaviness starts to lift. The atmosphere changes. Invisible forces lose their grip. This is not imagination. It is the effect of divine authority being exercised. It is the result of Saint Michael fighting in the realm the eyes cannot perceive. And as he breaks each link, each attachment, each shadow, the soul begins to feel lighter, freer, and more stable. When the prayer reaches its final moment, the soul must seal what has been cut. It must ask God to close every spiritual door that darkness tried to enter. It must ask Saint Michael to stand guard behind the person, ensuring that nothing pursuing them can return. This sealing is crucial. Deliverance without sealing leaves space for reattachment. But when the prayer seals the soul under God's protection, the enemy is denied access. The person may feel warmth, peace, clarity, tears, or simply a deep stillness. These are the fruits of a prayer that cuts through invisible darkness. They are the signs that Saint Michael has moved, that the battle has shifted, that what once followed the soul now lies broken behind them. And now, strengthened by truth and aligned with heaven, the soul is ready to discern the evidence, the unmistakable signs that the darkness has collapsed, and Saint Michael has acted with decisive victory. The collapse of darkness, recognizing when Saint Michael has acted. When Saint Michael enters a spiritual battle on behalf of a soul, his work is swift, precise, and absolute. Darkness does not fade gradually under his command. It collapses. The enemy's pursuit does not weaken over time. It is severed. But because this battle unfolds in the unseen, many do not immediately recognize the signs of victory. They expect fireworks, dramatic sensations, or overwhelming emotional release. Yet Saint Michael's victories often appear in subtle but unmistakable ways that reveal the enemy's retreat and heaven's triumph. To understand these signs is to grow in spiritual maturity, to learn how heaven communicates, and to perceive how deeply the Archangel has intervened. The first sign is a shift in the spiritual atmosphere. The heaviness that pressed from behind, the weight that made the soul feel watched, followed, or drained, suddenly lifts. It may happen in a moment during prayer, or even hours later when the person realizes that something is different. The mind feels less crowded. The space around the person feels clearer. The pressure that once seemed constant evaporates. This shift is not psychological, it is spiritual. Saint Michael has swept away the oppressive presence that lingered behind the soul. The collapse of darkness begins with the cleansing of the atmosphere. A second sign is the return of interior balance. When darkness pursues a person, it distorts perception. Thoughts feel heavier. Emotions swing unexpectedly. Fear amplifies without cause. But once Saint Michael breaks the hidden attack, the soul regains its equilibrium. Thoughts become coherent. Emotions settle. Peace becomes accessible. The person may notice they are no longer reacting from fear, but responding from clarity. This restoration of balance is the fruit of spiritual order being re-established. Saint Michael has pushed back the enemy and returned the soul to a state of alignment with God. There is also the sign of release, a deep involuntary exhale, a cry that emerges unexpectedly, or a gentle trembling that signals the end of internal strain. These are not emotional outbursts. They are the body acknowledging spiritual deliverance. The physical form often carries the weight of unseen battles, and when those battles end, the body responds with relief. Saint Michael's victories are so profound that even the flesh recognizes them. A person who has been under spiritual pursuit often holds their breath without noticing, guarding themselves subconsciously. When the pursuit ends, breath flows again. Tears may come, not from sorrow, but from freedom. Another sign appears within prayer itself. Before deliverance, prayer may have felt difficult, fragmented, or impossible. Words may have felt empty. Silence may have felt threatening. But after Saint Michael breaks the hidden attack, prayer flows with surprising ease. The person feels drawn to God rather than blocked from Him. The desire to pray grows, often quietly but firmly. This is one of the clearest signs of archangelic intervention, the restoration of the soul's natural orientation toward God. Darkness disrupts prayer, Saint Michael restores it. A further sign is the return of courage. Pursuing darkness often instills a subtle but persistent fear, fear of the future, fear of failure, fear of unseen harm. It whispers uncertainty into the heart. But once Saint Michael intervenes, courage begins to rise. It may not appear as boldness at first. It may begin as a small but steady confidence. Decisions that once felt overwhelming become manageable. Situations that triggered anxiety no longer hold the same power. The person begins to walk forward with assurance, not because circumstances changed, but because the spiritual threat behind them has been destroyed. There is also a deeper, more intimate sign, the awareness of being accompanied. After Saint Michael defeats a pursuing force, the person often senses a new presence behind them, not a presence of fear, but of protection. It feels like being covered, like someone is walking behind them, ensuring nothing harmful approaches. This awareness is not imagination, it is the soul responding to the Archangel's guardianship. For where darkness once followed, now heaven follows. Where shadows once pressed, now divine strength stands. Another sign is clarity. During spiritual pursuit, confusion is one of the enemy's tools. Thoughts become clouded, decisions become tangled. The person feels lost within themselves. But after deliverance, clarity emerges. The mind can distinguish between true thoughts and intrusive ones. The heart can separate emotional truth from emotional distortion. The person begins to see reality with spiritual accuracy. This clarity is a sign that Saint Michael has cut through the fog the enemy created. Sometimes the sign is silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of victory. The inner noise of fear quiets, the restless agitation stops, the pressure behind the soul disappears. This silence can feel strange at first, especially to someone who has lived under hidden pursuit for a long time. But it is a sacred silence. It is the silence of Psalm 46, where God declares, "Be still and know that I am God." Saint Michael creates the space where this stillness can be felt. There may also be external signs. Relationships that were strained suddenly ease. Doors that were blocked open. Situations that were chaotic settle. The enemy's influence does not only affect the interior world, it often interferes with external circumstances as well. When Saint Michael breaks the hidden attack, the ripple effect reaches beyond the soul. Peace enters the environment. Order enters the home. Clarity enters interactions. The collapse of darkness is not confined to the invisible realm. It manifests in daily life. But perhaps the most profound sign is this: the soul begins to hope again. Not superficial hope, but deep spiritual hope, the kind that acknowledges God's presence even when challenges remain. The kind that trusts in divine protection without needing to see it. The kind that stands firm because it knows heaven stands with it. Hope is the final fruit of deliverance. and Saint Michael always leads the soul back to hope. When these signs appear, the person must understand they are not coincidences, they are not psychological shifts, they are the evidence of Saint Michael's decisive victory. The darkness that followed has fallen, the pursuit has ended, the enemy has been exposed, confronted, and destroyed. And now the soul is ready to walk forward under a new guardianship, the guardianship of God's warrior, who walks behind, beside, and before them. With the collapse of darkness understood, the soul is ready for the final seal, the blessing that ensures what once followed will never rise again. Final benediction. Saint Michael, walk behind me and break every shadow that tries to follow me. Saint Michael, faithful warrior of God and guardian of souls, I now stand at the end of this prayer, not as someone pursued by darkness, but as someone defended by heaven. Yet I ask for more than deliverance in this moment. I ask for your continuous protection. Walk behind me, guard every step I take, break every shadow that attempts to follow, every whisper of fear that tries to return, every residue of darkness that seeks another opportunity to cling. Let the path behind me be sealed by divine fire, so that nothing unholy can trace my steps or touch my spirit again. Walk behind me, Saint Michael, when I rise tomorrow into the responsibilities of life. Go before my decisions and stand behind my thoughts. Surround my heart so fully that nothing from the past can reach toward me with chains disguised as memories. Break the invisible threads that once tied my spirit to heaviness. Cut away every lingering influence that darkness hoped to use again. Let the light of God follow me as surely as the sun follows the morning. And where the enemy once hid in the shadows, let your presence fill the space with unshakable strength. Walk behind me when I feel the old fears try to resurface, when anxiety attempts to echo the voices of yesterday, when the familiar pressure tries to settle on my shoulders again. Do not allow a single trace of the past pursuit to regain its place. Stand guard over my weaknesses, not as a reminder of fragility, but as a testament to the victory you have secured. Let every vulnerable place within me be covered by your shield. And every time fear looks for an opening, let it find only your sword waiting. Walk behind me into the silent hours of the night. Guard my sleep. Guard my dreams. Guard the unseen between dusk and dawn, where the enemy searches for doorways. Let no darkness approach my resting place. Let no shadow enter my home. Seal every room, every corner, every threshold with your protection. Surround the walls with the light of God's presence. Let even the air within my home carry the peace that comes from your nearness. And if any hidden force tries to reattach itself, drive it away before it reaches my door. Walk behind me in moments of exhaustion, when my spirit feels thin and my strength runs low. These are the moments the enemy waits for, but today I ask that you stand watch in those moments with greater vigilance than ever. Strengthen me when I cannot strengthen myself. Remind me of God's sovereignty when my thoughts begin to spiral. Hold back the shadows with divine authority when I cannot lift my own guard. Let the very spaces of my weakness become places where heaven proves its power. Walk behind me in every place my feet touch, in my home, in my workplace, in my relationships, in my conversations, in my decisions, and in the quiet moments when my heart is vulnerable. Let your protection surround my steps so completely that even when I move into unfamiliar territory, the enemy cannot trace me. Cleanse the path behind me of every spiritual residue. Do not allow anything unholy to follow the footprints of a soul that belongs to God. Walk behind me and break every shadow that tries to follow, not with gentle separation, but with total destruction. Shatter the chains at their root. Crush the seeds planted by fear. Burn away every spiritual attachment that does not belong to God. Do not allow any influence, memory, voice, or presence to trail behind me. Let the only shadow that touches my life be the shadow of God's wing, as described in Psalm 91. Let the only presence pursuing me be the mercy of the Lord, as declared in Psalm 23. Walk behind me and sanctify the ground I leave behind. Let every step I take leave peace, not fear. Let every room I enter retain light after I leave. Let my presence carry the imprint of heaven's strength rather than the residue of spiritual battle. Let every place where darkness once hovered become a place where your victories are remembered. Walk behind me, Saint Michael, and walk with me. Let your shield cover my right side. Let your sword guard my left. Let your wings overshadow every direction of my life. Stand before me to open the path God intends. Stand behind me to prevent the past from reclaiming me. Stand beside me so that I never forget heaven is closer than fear. And now, with full trust, I surrender my life, my steps, my thoughts, my past, my future, my battles, and my peace into the hands of God under your protection. I seal myself in the precious blood of Christ. I place my home, my journey, and my spirit beneath your guardianship. I declare with confidence that no shadow can follow me, no darkness can pursue me, and no unseen force can trace my steps, because Saint Michael now walks behind me. Let what follows me now be only goodness, mercy, and the presence of God. Let what accompanies me now be only light. And let every day forward be marked not by fear, but by the certainty that heaven stands guard behind my soul. Amen.